The town of Purcell, Oklahoma, is a place where afternoons often seem to move slowly. Rows of low apartment buildings, quiet streets, and the familiar sense of safety that comes with a small community. No one there imagined that behind a closed door, an irreversible tragedy was waiting, one that would take the life of a child and leave a wound that would never heal in the heart of the entire town. Number 1. Haime Rose Bolan. Haime Rose Bolan was only 10 years old. She was a bright, likable girl who loved to smile and was always eager to tell her father about the small details of her day. That afternoon, Haime walked home after a school-related activity. It was a familiar route, just a few minutes from one apartment building to the next. Jaime's father was working late, so she often stayed home alone until he returned. Nothing seemed unusual. There were no warning signs. It was just an ordinary afternoon, like so many others in her young life. But Haime never made it home. The silence, stretching longer than usual, began to worry her father. That worry quickly turned into fear. When news of Jaime's disappearance spread, the entire apartment complex was left in shock. Neighbors abandoned their dinners, police were called in, and an Amber Alert was issued. For 2 days, hundreds of people searched everywhere, hoping for a miracle. They didn't know that Jaime was very close. So close, it was heartbreaking.
Kevin Ray Underwood lived in the same apartment complex. A 44-year-old man who worked ordinary jobs stocking shelves, serving fast food. He kept to himself, spoke little, and was nearly invisible to his neighbors. No one really knew him. But in the months leading up to that day, dark thoughts had been growing inside Underwood's mind. Disturbing fantasies, words written down, then torn apart, plans nurtured in silence. He watched, he waited, and he knew that Jaime was often alone. On April 12, 2006, as Jaime walked past his apartment, Underwood called out to her. He told her he had a pet rat and asked if she wanted to see it. It sounded harmless coming from an adult who didn't seem threatening. Jaime, with the innocence and trust of a child, agreed. She stepped inside the apartment, and the door closed behind her. Inside the apartment, Underwood turned on the television for Jaime. A familiar cartoon played on the screen, creating a sense of safety. Then, in an instant, everything collapsed. The crime unfolded in a horrifying silence. Afterward, Underwood wrapped Jaime's body, hid it inside a large plastic container, and placed it in the bedroom closet. Outside, life went on as usual. He even joined the search, spoke calmly with police, while the horrific truth was only a few steps away. The breakthrough came from something very small, a conversation, a subtle feeling that something about Underwood's behavior wasn't right. When police asked for permission to search his apartment, he agreed. And when the plastic container was opened, any remaining hope disappeared. Jaime was found, and justice began its slow, inevitable journey. Underwood was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. For nearly 2 decades, he lived on death row, filing repeated appeals and citing mental health issues. Each one was denied. Jaime's family waited. They grew older with that pain, carrying the image of a little girl forever frozen at the age of 10. On the morning of December 19, 2024, Kevin Underwood's 45th birthday, the sentence was carried out. He apologized. He said he deserved to die. But no words could change what had been done. As the lethal drugs entered his body, one chapter closed. But there was no true sense of closure. For Jaime's family, it was relief mixed with emptiness. Justice had been carried out, but Jaime would never come home. For Purcell, it was a reminder that evil does not always wear a frightening face. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, living among us, waiting for the moment to destroy everything. And the question remains quiet and haunting. Is justice enough to heal losses that cannot be measured? Or are there wounds that time, verdicts, and even death itself can never erase? Number 2. The Bever brothers. Just after midnight on July 22, 2015, the 911 dispatch center in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma received a disturbing call. On the other end of the line was the weak voice of a young boy. He said his family was under attack. The dispatcher tried to calm him, asking for clarification. The boy corrected himself, not his parents, but his brothers. Those were the final, broken words of 12-year-old Daniel Bever. By the time police arrived, his time was nearly gone. The house on Magnolia Court, quiet, like so many other suburban homes, had become the scene of a nightmare. Near the front entrance, officers found 13-year-old Crystal, her body covered in stab wounds, her throat cut, yet still barely alive. With the last of her strength, she spoke 2 names, Robert and Michael, her brother. Inside the house, 5 bodies were scattered across different rooms. The parents, David and April Bever, along with 3 of their younger children, 12-year-old Daniel, 7-year-old Christopher, and 5-year-old Victoria. A total of 141 stab wounds. A number that was more than a statistic, it reflected a level of brutality beyond comprehension. Amid all of it, a 2-year-old child was found alive, hiding under a bed. Too young to understand what had happened, yet destined to carry fragments of that trauma for a lifetime. The Bever family lived a very isolated life. The children were homeschooled, rarely interacting with the outside world. Neighbors knew they existed, but didn't truly know who they were. Still, there was something about Robert and Michael that unsettled people's cold eyes, a distance that was hard to explain. No one knew that behind closed doors, a plan for mass murder had been quietly forming for months. According to later testimony, this was not an emotional outburst. 18-year-old Robert was the leader. He and his 16-year-old brother Michael had studied serial killers, stockpiled knives, and fantasized about fame. Their goal did not end with their family. They wanted to kill 50 people, maybe more. Robert said he wanted to be remembered. He wanted a Wikipedia page. He wanted the sense of power of someone who believed himself godlike. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, the brothers began. They attacked their parents first, then moved from room to room. Daniel tried to call 911 but was discovered. Crystal fought back, ran, and by a cruel miracle survived. When police found Robert and Michael in a nearby wooded area, their clothes soaked in blood, it was over. During the interrogations, Robert smiled. He recounted everything as if he were talking about a movie. No remorse, no fear. Michael was quieter, like a shadow standing behind his older brother. But that silence was not enough to erase responsibility. Both were charged with first-degree murder. Robert accepted a plea deal, avoiding the death penalty, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He disappeared behind bars ironically, into the very fate he feared most, being forgotten. Michael was tried as an adult. The jury did not believe he was merely a manipulated follower. His sentence was 5 consecutive life terms, effectively a lifetime behind prison walls. The Bever house was later demolished. The place that once witnessed the tragedy was turned into a memorial space, an imperfect attempt at healing. Crystal and the youngest child were adopted and began new lives, far from the public eye. They survived, but they never escaped the memories. The Bever case left behind a painful question. How can violence grow inside a family? How can isolation, hatred, and warning signs remain completely hidden? And more importantly, how many other closed doors are out there, concealing horrors we could never imagine? Number 3. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. The morning of April 19, 1995 began like any other in Oklahoma City. Clear skies, soft sunlight. Office workers walked into the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building to start their day. Parents dropped off their children at the daycare center on the 2nd floor, kissed them on the forehead, and hurried away believing they would return by the end of the day. None of them knew it would be the last time they would see one another. At 9:02 a.m. an explosion tore through the air. The building's north face collapsed like a sandcastle. Glass shattered, concrete rained down onto the street, and smoke and dust filled the sky. In just a few seconds, ordinary life turned into hell. Screams echoed through the rubble. Survivors dug with their bare hands, searching for coworkers, searching for their children, searching for any sign of life. The bomb was planted inside a rented truck, packed with more than 4,000 pounds of fertilizer-based explosives. The blast damaged or destroyed hundreds of surrounding buildings. 168 people were killed. Among them were 19 children who never had the chance to grow up, never had the chance to understand what the world was. In the chaos that followed, America stood still. This was not an attack from abroad, not a foreign enemy. This was domestic terrorism, born from hatred nurtured inside a single individual. Timothy McVeigh, a Gulf War veteran, was the man behind the bombing. He had once been seen as a model soldier, but after leaving the military, McVeigh became increasingly consumed by anti-government ideology. He came to believe that the federal government was the enemy of its own people. Events like Ruby Ridge and Waco became obsessions, what McVeigh saw as proof of tyranny that had to be avenged. April 19 was not chosen at random. It marked the anniversary of the Waco siege. To McVeigh, the date was a message written in blood, an act he believed was justified. But what he truly left behind were bodies, tears, and devastation. McVeigh did not act alone. Terry Nichols, a former Army friend, was his accomplice. Nichols helped gather materials, prepare the bomb, and shared McVeigh's distorted belief that violence was the answer. When the bomb exploded, Nichols was not at the scene, but his role was undeniable. Just 90 minutes after the blast, McVeigh was pulled over by police for driving without a license plate. A detail that seemed minor, but one that prevented him from disappearing. When investigators traced a vehicle identification number fragment recovered from the rubble, the pieces quickly fell into place. America was forced to face a terrifying truth. The killer did not come from far away. He was an American citizen. McVeigh's trial unfolded under a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The families of the victims sat face to face with the man who had taken their entire world from them. McVeigh showed no remorse. He referred to the deaths of children as collateral damage, words that only deepened the pain. The jury returned a verdict of death. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection. His final words were not an apology, but a poem about fate and pride. For many families, McVeigh's death brought no relief. It closed a chapter, but it did not erase the memories. Terry Nichols was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his life in a maximum security facility, completely cut off from the outside world. The site of the Murrah Federal Building is now a memorial. 168 empty chairs stand in silence. 19 of them are smaller, reserved for children. Each chair represents a life, a story cut short. The Oklahoma City bombing changed America. It forced the nation to confront the danger of extremism growing from within its own society. And years later, the question still echoes. When hatred is nurtured long enough, when violence is believed to be righteous, at what point does the line between human and monster disappear? Number 4. Julius Jones. 4 hours. That was all the time Julius Jones had left on the morning of November 18, 2021. 4 hours to breathe, to think, to wait for a decision that could end everything. Outside the Oklahoma prison, crowds gathered in silence. Some prayed. Some held signs. Others simply stood there, trying to understand how a man could be brought to the edge of death while questions about his guilt had never been fully answered. 22 years earlier, Julius Jones was just 19 years old, a young black man raised in Oklahoma City, living with his family, with no serious history of violent crime. On July 28, 1999, Paul Howell, a businessman, was shot and killed in front of his parents' home while picking up his children. The crime shocked the community. A father was taken in an instant, leaving a void that could never be filled for the Howell family. Police quickly arrested Julius Jones. Inside his family's home, they found a gun wrapped in a red bandana. Prosecutors claimed it was the murder weapon. Christopher Jordan, an associate of Jones, accepted a plea deal and testified that it was Jones who pulled the trigger. That testimony became the foundation of the entire case. But from the very beginning, Julius Jones maintained that he was innocent. He said that on the night of the crime, he was at home with his family eating dinner and playing board games. His family confirmed his account. The jury, however, was not convinced. Jones did not take the stand. Alibi witnesses were not fully presented. The trial moved quickly, and a death sentence was handed down. Time passed on death row, year after year. Julius Jones lived within 4 walls, watching his life slip by behind steel bars. But outside the prison, doubts continued to grow. More and more people began questioning the testimony of Christopher Jordan, an accomplice who directly benefited from shifting the blame onto someone else. 3 witnesses later stated that Jordan had privately confessed to them that he was the one who pulled the trigger. An independent investigation commissioned by Oklahoma lawmakers concluded that no reasonable jury, if presented with all of the available evidence, could have convicted Julius Jones of first-degree murder. The report pointed to serious failures, ranging from ineffective legal defense to indications of racial bias in the courtroom. The story of Julius Jones spread across the United States. Millions signed petitions. Celebrities, athletes, and human rights activists spoke out. Protests erupted. But on the other side, the Howell family was in pain as well. They believed Jones was guilty. They believed justice had been served, and that prolonging the case only ensured their wounds would never heal. As the execution date approached, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted to recommend clemency for Jones. It was a rare decision, one that suggested even those within the system felt uneasy. But the final decision rested with the governor. Minute by minute, time slipped away. And then just 4 hours before the scheduled execution, Governor Kevin Stitt signed the commutation order. The death sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Julius Jones would not walk free, but he would not die that day. Outside the prison, the crowd broke down in tears, not in celebration, but in the fragile relief that a tragedy had been stopped at the last possible moment. For the Howell family, the decision was a new kind of pain. For Jones's supporters, it was an acknowledgement that the system may have been wrong. Julius Jones remains behind bars. He continues to maintain his innocence. His case has become a symbol of much larger questions about the death penalty, about wrongful convictions, and about whether justice can truly exist when a single mistake is enough to take a human life. And that question, even now, has no final answer. Number 5. Brenda Andrew. In November 2001, in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Oklahoma, Rob Andrew returned home after a long day at work. He was the father of 2 young children and was going through a deeply strained marriage with his wife, Brenda Andrew. As Rob stepped into the garage, gunshots rang out. 2 shots ended his life in just seconds. Brenda was wounded in the arm. Panicked, she called for help, telling police that a masked intruder had attacked them and then fled. At first, the story sounded plausible, a family tragedy caused by random violence. But as investigators began piecing together the details, the picture started to distort. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. And Brenda's account changed with each interrogation. Small details seemingly harmless on their own began to form a much darker suspicion. Rob had previously reported to police that his car's brake system had been tampered with. He feared someone was trying to harm him. That fear, it turned out, was not unfounded. Rob and Brenda's marriage was on the verge of collapse. Brenda was having an affair with Jim Pavat, an insurance agent who also happened to be the man who sold Rob a large life insurance policy, naming Brenda as the beneficiary. Just months before Rob's death, the policy had been finalized. The timing made everything feel heavier, as if fate itself had been set in motion. Eventually, Jim Pavat confessed that he was the one who pulled the trigger. But the confession did not bring the case to a close. Pavat claimed that Brenda was the mastermind, the one who planned it all, who pushed him to kill Rob for the insurance money and the promise of a new life. 2 people, 2 conflicting stories, each blaming the other. And between them, the truth became increasingly difficult to see. Brenda Andrews' trial took place in 2004. But what made it so controversial was not only the evidence, it was the way the story was presented to the jury. Prosecutors spent a significant amount of time focusing on Brenda's personal life. How she dressed, her romantic relationships, her role as a wife and a mother. It felt as though they were not only trying a crime, but putting Brenda herself on trial, judging her against harsh moral standards imposed on women. In one particularly shocking moment, a prosecutor held up personal items taken from Brenda's luggage when she left town with her children. He asked the jury whether a grieving widow would behave that way. The question was aimed not just at guilt, but at character. And it left a lasting impression on the courtroom. The jury convicted Brenda Andrew and sentenced her to death. She became the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. For years, she appealed her conviction, arguing that her trial had been unfair, that she was sentenced not only for what she was accused of doing, but for failing to fit society's expectations of what a woman should be. More than 20 years later, in January 2025, the United States Supreme Court agreed to review the case. The justices concluded that prosecutors may have gone too far, allowing gender bias and irrelevant evidence to influence the trial. The ruling did not declare Brenda Andrew innocent, but it acknowledged that justice may have been distorted by emotion and prejudice. Today, Brenda Andrew remains incarcerated, waiting for her fate to be decided. Her case has become a symbol of a larger question: can a trial truly be fair when it is shaped by social expectations? And can justice stand firm when the line between evidence and prejudice becomes so fragile? The story of Brenda Andrew is not only the story of a murder. It is a story about how we judge people, about how justice is sometimes shaped not solely by facts, but by the way society chooses to see the person standing before the court. Number 6. Richard Glossip. Richard Glossip has prepared to die 9 times. 9 times he ate a final meal. 9 times he said goodbye to the world. And 9 times just hours, sometimes minutes before the end, death was postponed. For nearly 30 years, Glossip has lived on Oklahoma's death row, where every morning could be his last. A life stretched out not by hope, but by relentless waiting. The case began in 1997 at a small motel called the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City. Richard Glossip was the manager. The motel's owner, Barry Van Treese, came by to review the books and collect money. He never left alive. Barry's body was found inside a room, beaten to death with a baseball bat. The person who carried out the killing was Justin Sneed, a young maintenance worker, addicted to drugs, with a history of theft. Sneed quickly confessed to the killing, but his confession did not close the case. He claimed he had not acted alone. According to Sneed, Richard Glossip was the one behind it all, allegedly hiring him to murder the motel owner in order to take control of the business and cover up stolen money. In exchange for this testimony, Sneed avoided the death penalty and received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Glossip, who never struck a single blow, was the one facing execution. Richard Glossip has always maintained his innocence. He admitted that after the murder, out of fear, he helped Sneed conceal certain evidence. But he insisted that he had no prior knowledge of the plan and that he never hired anyone to kill his boss. Prosecutors offered Glossip a deal: admit guilt in exchange for his life. He refused. He said he could not confess to something he did not do. The first trial ended with a death sentence, but it was overturned after it was ruled that Glossip had not received adequate legal representation. A second trial followed in 2004, once again relying on the same key witness, Justin Sneed. Once again, the jury believed the testimony of the actual killer, a man with a clear motive to lie. Richard Glossip was sentenced to death again. Years passed on death row. Meanwhile, doubts continued to pile up. Independent investigations later revealed that prosecutors had withheld critical information. Justin Sneed had previously been diagnosed with a mental disorder and prescribed lithium facts that directly affected the credibility of his testimony. That information was never disclosed to Glossip's defense attorneys. In court, Sneed testified that he had never seen a psychiatrist, and no one corrected the lie. The turning point came from an unexpected place. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond, an outspoken supporter of the death penalty, announced that Richard Glossip had not received a fair trial. He called for the conviction to be overturned, openly acknowledging that the system had failed. The state courts, however, refused. In the end, the case reached the United States Supreme Court. In February 2025, the court ruled to overturn Richard Glossip's conviction and ordered a new trial. The justices made it clear that allowing false testimony to stand in a death penalty case is unacceptable. When a human life is at stake, there is no room for carelessness, and no room for lies. Richard Glossip was removed from death row. He was not set free, but for the first time in nearly 3 decades, he was no longer living under the constant shadow of imminent death. He had grown old behind bars. 62 years old, a life suspended between guilt and doubt. The family of Barry Van Treese remains in pain. They have waited nearly 30 years for justice and still have no final answers. And Glossip, too, remains in limbo. He still faces the possibility of a new trial. He has not been exonerated. The question of truth remains unresolved. And for everyone involved, the waiting continues. The case of Richard Glossip is not just the story of one man. It is a chilling warning about a system in which the word of someone with every reason to lie can bring another person to the brink of death. And it leaves behind a haunting question. If one man can prepare to die 9 times for a crime never fully proven, how many others are living in that same shadow, silently waiting for their turn? Number 7. Sean Bossa. Some crimes are not born from deep hatred or sudden rage. They grow out of something far smaller, far more ordinary: greed. The case of Sean Bossa is one of those stories, a story in which love, trust, and the idea of home were destroyed over a handful of items meant to be pawned. In 2010, Katrina Griffin lived with her 2 young children in a mobile home in rural Dibble, Oklahoma. It wasn't a life of comfort, but it was a home. Katrina was a devoted mother. Christian, 8 years old, was energetic and quick to smile. Chidity, 6, was still too young to understand how cruel the world could be. Sean Bossa was Katrina's boyfriend. Their relationship was troubled, marked by instability and tension, but Katrina still believed things could get better. That trust ended on a July morning. Neighbors saw smoke rising from the mobile home. Firefighters arrived and discovered a horrifying scene. 3 bodies were found inside. Katrina and Christian had been stabbed multiple times. Chidity had no stab wounds but died from smoke inhalation. The fire was not an accident. It was set to destroy evidence. The investigation quickly turned to Sean Bossa. Just hours after the fire, he was seen pawning belongings that belonged to Katrina and her children. Small, ordinary items, pieces of their daily lives, became undeniable evidence. During questioning, Bossa's story changed again and again, eventually collapsing under forensic proof. He was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. At trial, prosecutors described Bossa's crime not as a loss of control, but as cold calculation. He killed Katrina because she discovered he had been stealing from her. He killed Christian because the boy was a witness, and Chidity died from smoke inhalation, the consequence of a ruthless act meant to cover up the truth. The jury returned 3 death sentences. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But then the case took an unexpected turn. In 2020, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in McGirt v. Oklahoma, recognizing that large portions of land in Oklahoma remain legally classified as tribal territory. Katrina Griffin and her children were members of the Chickasaw Nation. The crime had occurred on tribal land. That meant the state of Oklahoma never had jurisdiction to prosecute Sean Bossa. And with that realization, the case was thrown into legal uncertainty, raising a question far larger than one man's guilt, and exposing the fragile line between justice and jurisdiction.
In an instant, the death sentences were vacated. Sean Bossa was removed from death row. For Katrina's family, it was a brutal shock. They had waited more than a decade to see justice carried out, only to watch it vanish because of a legal dispute. Their grief was torn open once again, not by the crime itself, but by the system. What followed was a legal battle steeped in chaos. State prosecutors pushed back. Courts argued over whether the McGirt ruling should apply retroactively. In the meantime, Sean Bossa became the embodiment of an uncomfortable question. When legal procedure collides with our sense of justice, who is the one who pays the price? In the end, the Oklahoma courts ruled that McGirt did not apply to convictions that had already been finalized. Sean Bossa's sentence was reinstated. He was returned to death row, the same place he had stood before everything was thrown into chaos. For Katrina Griffin's family, it was a delayed sense of relief. Not because the pain had faded, but because the system had, at least, returned to its starting point. Katrina, Christian, and Chidity will never come back. But their story reminds us that justice is rarely a straight line. It is winding, controversial, and sometimes it wounds the very people who are searching for it. The case of Sean Bossa leaves behind a chilling lesson, that a single moment of greed can destroy multiple lives, and that in the pursuit of justice, human suffering is sometimes caught between the cold, unfeeling lines of the law. Number 8. Chase Ainsworth. A summer afternoon in 2023 inches, Oklahoma City passed under the familiar, oppressive heat. No one imagined that within hours, a family would be permanently shattered. When an Amber Alert lit up the phones of thousands of people, the message was chilling. A 5-year-old boy had been abducted by his own father following a violent incident. The search began immediately urgent, tense, and filled with fear of the worst. The child was the son of Samantha Ainsworth. Samantha had once been in what seemed like an ordinary marriage with Chase Ainsworth. They fell in love, had a child together, and once dreamed of a peaceful home. But over time, the relationship became suffocating. Chase grew increasingly controlling, jealous, and aggressive. Samantha made the decision to divorce him, a choice that was not easy, but one she believed was necessary to protect both herself and her son. The divorce was finalized at the end of 2022. Samantha was granted primary custody of their son. Chase was allowed visitation only under court-ordered conditions. But to Chase, that arrangement was unacceptable. He began showing up unannounced, sending threatening messages, and violating the protective order Samantha had obtained from the court. Samantha did everything the law allowed. She saved the messages. She contacted the police. She reached out to family and friends. She said she was afraid, and that fear was real. On the 29th of July 2023, Chase came to Samantha's home. Their son was there. What followed happened quickly and with brutal finality. Chase attacked Samantha with a knife, cutting her throat. There was no chance to fight back, no way to escape. Samantha collapsed inside the very home she believed was her safest place. The 5-year-old boy was in another room. He did not witness it directly, but he heard it, sounds no child should ever have to hear. After killing Samantha, Chase abducted their son and fled by car. An Amber Alert was issued. Police searched minute by minute, every second heavy with fear. Thankfully, just a few hours later, the child was found alive and unharmed. Samantha was not. Her family and friends were devastated. They described Samantha as a gentle mother who always put her child first. She did not seek conflict. She wanted only a quiet life and the chance to raise her son in peace. But all the protective measures, the court orders, the reports, the calls for help, were not enough to save her from a man who could not accept being left behind. Chase Ainsworth was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, child abduction, and violation of a protective order. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no doubt about what had happened. But as the case moved toward justice, the question became, what punishment could ever be enough? Prosecutors had the option to seek the death penalty. The crime was premeditated, preceded by a history of threats, and rooted in prolonged domestic violence. In the end, Chase accepted a plea deal. He avoided the death penalty, but was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The rest of his life will be spent behind bars. For Samantha's family, it was a bitter form of closure. There would be no drawn-out trials, no lingering fear that the man who killed her might one day walk free. But there was also no verdict, no sentence that could ever bring Samantha back. The case of Chase Ainsworth is a painful warning. Domestic violence does not begin with murder. It begins with small signs, with control, with threats that are dismissed or minimized. Protective orders, while necessary, can become fragile when they are not enforced with real strength. And what remains, after everything, is a child. A boy who will grow up carrying the memory of a mother who tried to protect him until her final moments. Samantha is gone, but her story reminds us that silence in the face of violence can become a form of complicity, and sometimes, the cost of delay is a life that can never be restored. Number 9. Tamine Wood. On the night of the 13th of November, 2006, Oklahoma City settled into its familiar quiet. In a narrow alley, a man named Troy Wacker was shot and killed. There were no direct witnesses, no surveillance cameras, only darkness and confusion. When police arrived at the scene, they knew this would be a difficult case. And in cases like this, the truth is not always the first thing to be found. At the time, Tamine Wood was an ordinary man, living quietly, largely unnoticed. He had a history of minor run-ins with the law, but he was not a murderer. Still, just days after the killing, Wood was arrested. The primary reason was not physical evidence, but the testimony of his own brother. The brother told police that Tamine had confessed to the murder. In that moment, Wood's fate shifted onto a path he never could have imagined. The trial moved quickly. Prosecutors built their case around the brother's testimony and a handful of circumstantial witnesses. There was no DNA, no murder weapon was ever found, but the jury decided that a second-hand confession was enough. Tamine Wood was sentenced to death. As the verdict was read, he stood still, no screaming, no protest, just the quiet collapse of a man who had just been condemned to die. The years that followed passed slowly on death row. Wood lived day by day with an execution date hanging over him. But what caused him the deepest pain was not the approaching death, it was the betrayal. His own brother, the one person who might have saved him, was the very person who pushed him into the darkness. The family shattered, silent dinners, prison visits filled with tears. Then the truth began to leak out. The brother changed his story. In private conversations, he admitted that he was the one who had pulled the trigger. He said he had lied to escape responsibility. But the legal system does not turn easily. That late confession was deemed unreliable. Appeals were denied. The wheels of justice kept turning, despite the cries for help. In 2022, Tamine Wood's execution date was set. The lethal injection protocol was prepared. His family braced for the worst. Wood wrote his final letters. He apologized to his mother. He said he no longer hated his brother. The words of a man who had accepted death, even knowing it might not be just. Just minutes before the scheduled execution, something unprecedented happened. The governor of Oklahoma issued a commutation order. The death sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tamine Wood was taken out of the death chamber. There were no cheers, only quiet tears. A life was spared, but justice remained unanswered. For the family of Troy Wacker, the decision was another blow. They had waited for closure, only to see it delayed once again. Their pain did not disappear with the stroke of a pen. And for Wood's family, it was relief mixed with anguish. Their son was alive, but he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case of Tamine Wood became a symbol of a terrifying question. If a person can be brought to the edge of death based on a single lie, how many others are standing on that same precipice? And when the truth arrives too late, does justice still have meaning? Tamine Wood is still alive. But each day he lives is a reminder that between right and wrong, between life and death, the distance can sometimes be only a few minutes and a single human decision. Number 10. Rebecca Bryan. In the small town of Waukeeta, Oklahoma, the name Michael Bryan was once synonymous with trust. He was the captain of the volunteer fire department, the man who showed up first when accidents, fires, or tragedies struck. To the community, Michael represented responsibility and courage. No one imagined that he would die inside his own home, and even fewer imagined that the person responsible would be his wife. Rebecca Bryan appeared before neighbors as a grieving spouse. She cried, trembled, and said that her husband had been shot in the garage one evening in 2011. She spoke of an intruder, a sudden attack, a tragedy no one could have foreseen. In those first hours, police believed her story. Michael was a good man. Rebecca was a shaken widow. Everything seemed clear. But the crime scene did not lie. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. And most importantly, cracks began to appear in Rebecca's story. The timeline, the positions, the sounds she claimed to have heard. Small inconsistencies, on their own insignificant, slowly accumulated into suspicion. As investigators dug deeper into the Bryans' marriage, a different picture began to emerge. Michael and Rebecca were no longer happy. On the surface, they appeared to be a model family, but behind closed doors were arguments, mounting debt, and long-standing emotional distance. Rebecca was involved in an extramarital affair. She dreamed of a different life, one that felt freer, lighter, easier to breathe in. And in her mind, Michael's name gradually became an obstacle. Investigators discovered that Michael carried multiple life insurance policies with a combined value that was substantial, and Rebecca was the primary beneficiary. Just months before Michael's death, those policies had been updated. The timing could not be dismissed as coincidence. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to fit together, revealing a clear and calculated motive. In subsequent interrogations, Rebecca grew increasingly unsettled. She changed her statements. She forgot details she had once described with confidence. Eventually, the pressure of the truth caused her story to unravel. Prosecutors came to believe that Rebecca had planned her husband's murder, staged the scene to resemble a failed break-in, and then played the role of the grieving widow before the entire town. Rebecca Bryan's trial unfolded under a heavy atmosphere. Firefighters filled the courtroom seats. They were not there simply to hear a verdict, but to say goodbye to a brother in the only way they had left. Prosecutors did not portray Rebecca as a monster. Instead, they laid out a sequence of choices, each one leading her further down a path with no way back. The jury found Rebecca Bryan guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. There was no death penalty, no last-minute drama. Only a crushing silence as a woman was led out of the courtroom, and a community officially lost the final trace of faith in a story they had once believed to be true. Michael Bryan was laid to rest with full firefighter honors. The bell rang. A helmet was placed on the casket. His fellow firefighters stood in silence, heads bowed. They were accustomed to facing death, but not betrayal. Rebecca Bryan entered prison carrying a life sentence. She was no longer a wife, no longer a widow, only a person left to live with the consequences of her own choices. This case is not just the story of a murder. It is a bitter reminder that evil does not always shout. Sometimes, it whispers, hiding within the closest relationships. And when greed merges with deception, the cost is not only a single life, but the permanent shattering of an entire community's trust.